This programme was produced at and first aired on MPR, Manawatu People's Radio, with support from New Zealand On Air. Ka pai Irarangi Tamotu, MPR.
Kia ora and welcome to Reserved Recommendations, a show about problematic faves, great trash, difficult art, and our complex relationship with art and entertainment. My name's Hugh, I'm the host, and I'd like to put in a very mild content warning for this show as a whole. Sometimes our recommendations on this show are reserved just because the thing that we're discussing is in some way not good. But sometimes there are aspects to the art or artist that may be confronting for some people. Read the episode descriptions for more information, and do be aware of your listening environment.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Reserved Recommendations. This is becoming an ongoing series where I get my brother Angus on and bother him about things. And I consider this maybe a companion episode to a previous episode we did way back, quite close to the start of the show. I think like episode 4 or 5 or something, not far into the series. Someone who's looking at the YouTube playlist can tell me because it's an old enough episode that it's fallen off the podcasts at any rate. I talked to a woman called Emma Gamegami, who goes by Emma G, about feminism. She's a musician based in the States, and she had a lot of interesting things to say, although her recommendations were not particularly reserved. She just kind of went, this is a good idea. This is a companion episode in the sense that Gus was interested in talking about men and masculinity, and I thought there was another kind of parallel conversation perhaps to be had there about white men in particular and whiteness as a concept, because I think that those things are related. So, I mean, in the grand tradition of podcasts where white blokes talk about stuff, we might have an episode where white blokes take a spanner to both whiteness and blokeness and see what happens. So after that ridiculously long preamble, it's like a minute 40 without letting my guests introduce themselves. How's it going, Gus? How's sunny Glasgow?
It is currently dark outside, as is usual here.
Yeah, glimpse behind the curtain. It's 9:45. And so that's 9:45 in the morning for me and 10:45 in the evening for Gus. He is being very kind.
No, it's going well. I am just coming off the back of mandatory holidays, given the current circumstances and the inability to take holidays. So let's start with some big reservations and why this is difficult to talk about. And so I guess the first thing that has to be said is anything within the next hour that I say that sounds like my answer to a problem is the words feminazi or anything like that, I have been either unclear or you're misinterpreting me. One of the really big difficulties of talking about this stuff and talking about masculinity and maleness and whiteness and stuff is a lot of the talking points are used by quite horrifying people like the MRAs who start at very sensible talking points and then very quickly devolve into but it's actually about the reason that these things are bad is because the feminazis or wokeness or identity politics. So anytime you hear me say something which might sound like that, that's not what I'm saying. I think feminism is great, and it's really great. I think it's also really important that we have a talk about masculinity and some of the problems around that men face that don't get pulled into the spotlight a lot. And that's sometimes a difficult conversation because, as I say, a lot of those are talking points for some really unpleasant people.
I think there's also I'm going to make a reference to like obscure cult literature here, but there's a problem that keeps being raised as a kind of metaphorical like thought exercise puzzle in the course of the book The Illuminatus Trilogy, which is, if you're wondering, just one book. The the way the puzzle is phrased is unlock this box with the key which is inside it. And the point is that there are some philosophical propositions or metaphorical constructs or social constructs where it's very hard to get a good look at them because you're inside them. And I think that that's particularly true when the constructs that you're talking about are in some way invisible. And what I mean by that is that we live in a world where largely, and this is a thing that benefits both of us in a number of ways, whiteness and maleness are a kind of presumed default. We are considered normal, and people who are less like us in whatever way, I suppose I should add like able-bodied and straight to that list as well, or at least straight presenting. The further you get away from that, the more your identity becomes part of your identity. And so because the things that personally define us, or that would personally define us if we were like trans or non-white or obviously disabled, are not obvious to anyone, our identities are essentially invisible, which means that you kind of have to like almost summon them into your presence with a ritual or something before you can actually take a look at them and figure out what the components are. Again, he took a ridiculously long time to try and explain a thing.
Okay, so let's start at the deep end then. I was going to try and like ease us into this point, but you started there, so hell, we'll go there. Okay, so let's talk about some anarchist theory about hierarchies.
Do it!
Let's start with like an example, because I'm a bit of a history nerd and I like Middle English history. If you think about Henry VIII, let's talk about Henry VIII. Henry VIII.
Speaking of toxic masculinity, let's talk about Henry VIII.
Let's talk Henry VIII, right? He wants to divorce his wife. The Catholic Church says no, and he forms the Anglican Church. Now, the thing about that Anglican Church is it's basically Catholicism with the serial numbers scraped off. And so this idea that he's the king, he could do whatever he liked, that's not true. If he decided to, like, we're going to make a democracy now, all of the, like, aristocracy would probably murder him and replace him with somebody who thought that's not a bad idea. So this is one of the things about hierarchies when we meet them. They're about they're big social things that keep people in positions of power. And even those people who are at the top end of that power, for a lot of reasons, find it very hard, even if that structure is very, in the case of masculinity, is very toxic and like dangerous for them, it's very hard to move out of that because the entire structure supporting you is keeping you in that structure.
Yeah, there's a thing that I want to say really quickly, just as I think it'll be a useful tool for listeners to have in their back pocket as this conversation continues as well, is because you mentioned like this big social thing, and really what we're talking about is the term social construct. And that's, you know, if you're going to put together a list of like top 50 misunderstood terms, that's right up there with toxic masculinity, which I suppose we will also get to in due course. But the idea of a social construct is something that's made out of social rules. So while that might mean it is in some sense imaginary, in the sense that it exists on the inside of human heads and it's not part of like the laws of the universe, for example, a government or money or a social hierarchy, those are all things which are composed out of agreements between humans. But that doesn't mean that they're not real and don't have material effects on your life. You know, social clothing taboos are a social construct. Try going out in public butt naked and see how you do if you believe that means that they're made up. Yeah.
So yeah, like, I mean, this is again, because you brought it up, let's dwell on the point. Like, one of the other things I can use to frame one of the things that I think it's important to talk about is to, like, you with another male presenting person who's been their life with male, and we grew up in a very progressive household. That being said, but when did you learn that it was not okay to have feelings? Because I guarantee you, at some point in your life, as a male presenting person, you were taught that, and nobody walked up to either of us and said no. But at some point, we both learned that it was not okay to have feelings.
Yeah, and I mean, I think because I'm in the position of attempting to raise children now and attempting to maintain a fairly socially progressive household, and of course, your enemy in that is the world, because unless you are in a position to be able to homeschool your children, which is an entirely different kettle of worms, can of fish, then, you know, if you're not in a position to be able to do that, then your children are going to be socialized by the collective mass of everybody else's children. And that means that you have I'm going to say control, and I don't want this to come off as you know, it's very important to control your children. But you don't. You know, your kids go off into the great social milieu and they get whatever they get. And what they get is, like, everybody else's biases and unquestioned assumptions all stirred together in a pot. And they will pop out at whatever interval they pop out, and your kid will come back with, like, weird, hard-coded gender essentialist, but also, like, left field, because they've been taught by another 5-year-old assumptions about what makes a boy and a girl, or whatever the thing is. And I don't think, unless you want to be like a Mennonite or a monk, like, I don't think there's a way to live separate from the world. So you always have to deal with that collective mass of stuff.
Yeah, and so, like, one of the books, the book I will probably reference and tell people to read at the end of this podcast is a book called, I Don't Want to Talk About It, Overcoming the Secret Legacy of Male Depression by Terence. And in that book, he talks about his son. One of his sons enjoyed playing dress up and enjoyed putting on dresses. And one day he runs down and the older son and his friends are there. And he's excited to, like, see them because he likes this guy's friends and he's wearing his dress because that's what he does. And he walks in and everybody looks at him, and just the reading of their faces and their, like, their base start reaction, oh my God, there's somebody wearing a dress. That was enough to stop that behavior. Even though those people never said anything, never, like, were discouraging in any way, but the social reaction was there. So, like, let's be clear, the social constructs there is, it's in just bodily reactions, the way that we read social cues off other people.
Humans. Evolutionary psychology is, in most cases, bunk. But I think there is some merit in remembering that we are descended from apes, and that apes are, by and large, troop mammals who live through cooperating in an immensely complex set of social relationships. And so humans have more facial mobility muscles than muscles for basically any other function. And we're so good at faces that we see them in, like, inanimate objects and bits of weather. So, like, the amount of weight that you can get through completely unspoken social cues, and the amount of disability that people get from even a mild dysfunction in reading them is you can't discount that stuff. It's really enormous.
Yeah. And so yeah, like I guess I'm going to go back up to the front and kind of start again and kind of say, well, why is it important to talk about this? Because I think there is a narrative running through kind of criticism of where we are, which because we have a more privileged place in society says, well, Yabu sucks, suck it up, right? Like, oh, there are some problems that men are having. Yabu sucks. You're not suffering the massive amounts of oppression that we are over here. And I don't think that's the mainstream thought, but it's certainly something that you get back when you start talking about this. Why is it important? One of the reasons I kind of found this fascinating is I'd seen a lot of my male friends get to this kind of stuck point in life, which seemed to be very particular to my male friends that my female friends didn't seem to do, and it was something I recognized in myself. Just as, I don't know how to describe it, but being stuck. And then the other thing that I find fascinating is people who get into cults, people who get out of cults, people who lose religions, people who like go to very extreme points of view and get out of that. And so I was watching a video by a chap called Vander Hall, I believe his internet name is, about how he started down the alt-right rabbit hole. And he got through there by Gamergate. People don't know. Some people made some comments about some games, and those were female journalists, and they got kind of piled on.
Oh, it's more specific than that.
Yeah.
One person wrote a very small game in a text-based story game engine called Twine, called Depression Quest, and that person was accused of by a jealous ex-boyfriend of hers of having slept with game journalists in order to garner positive reviews, which factually did not exist, in order to profit from Depression Quest, which was free and therefore she could not profit from. And people were so eager to hear that it spun off into an organized harassment campaign against any women adjacent to video games in any context.
So what's really interesting about Vanderhall's story is that he was on like a young guy on this Minecraft server, and there were some fascist guys there, but like it was just jokes, right? And then the US court system, like there was the sort of political storm that happens every 3 or 4 or 5 months of video games are ruining our children. And so everybody started feeling really defensive about their video games, and he was in a rough place where he was again feeling this kind of stuckness and this bad relationship with his mother, having lots of trouble. And then Gamergate happened, and then the kind of alt-right guys and the thing was like, hey, how about this? Hey, how about this? Hey, how about this? And then he found himself stepping down this rabbit hole. And like, as I say, one of my interests is people who fall down these sort of rabbit holes and come back out. And the other thing was other people who fall into kind of white supremacist groups and incel groups. That's kind of the story. They got to this point of crisis or this point of like not knowing. And the only people there around were saying, well, we've got an answer. We're the alt-right guys, right? Like they were the ones who were like, oh, we can tell you exactly what's going on.
Also, I think it's worth noting that all of the on a less kind of organized and more personal level, there are a whole set of crimes in which men are overrepresented. And usually those crimes are related to violence and disorder, basically. and I would argue that those are not they're not crimes that people undertake for profit. Like it does not actually profit you to beat up your missus. That
No.
There is no immediate gain. There's no long-term gain in doing that. What you're doing when you do that is that you are acting out of a situation that you cannot cope with for some reason. And so I would say that people who wind up doing that stuff are doing a kind of like internal personalized version of the same thing, where they're kind of spiraling further and further into this world where the thing that they have recourse to is physical or emotional violence, and nobody understands that, and nobody is able to relate to them on any level other than them being dominated by this violence.
Yeah, so I think I'm going to pull one thing up from that, and I think it's because I think it's what I see as the problem, right? My view of one of the biggest problems is that the sort of social framework that teaches people how to deal with the world gives male-presenting people a set of hammers and then sends them into a world full of china shops, and then tells them to go like work in those china shops with these tools that we've given you, right? Like, because we work in a world that generally relies very heavily on being social and being able to take like social upset, to be able to take emotional upset in very well. And a lot of the tools that we get kind of socialized into young men are like, somebody gives you emotional upset, you punch them, right? Like, and then we wonder why people in relationships punch their partners, because they got given social upset and they reach for the tools that they had. And it's not good. And like, that's not like a get out of jail free card, but it's the, how do we get there? Well, they didn't have any other tools, right?
And also, I mean, there's a vicious cycle there to some extent as well, which is that because men are socialized to carry hammers, if we want to continue with that metaphor, what happens is that because every social process is like bidirectional. You know, you do a thing and you are perceived to do the thing, and you become the person who did the thing, if you see what I mean. There's a long joke about a man who had sex with a chicken once that relies on precisely this principle, which we can leave the listener to look up on their own leisure. However, because men are, as we say, given hammers, what happens is that everyone else learns that men are the people who have hammers, and that means that you can feel as a man like the people around you are allowed to express a full range of emotions, but once you express a certain level of anger or distress, that becomes threatening to the people around you, and therefore there's a double bind there, where if you accept the socialization, the acceptable way to express emotion is through anger and violence, but also if you're angry about something, you have to be very careful about, and you don't accept that socialization, and you just want to be open about your emotions. You have to be very cautious about how you express that anger, because everybody else around you will have learned that male anger is like quite dangerous, and they need to be really cautious when a man is angry, because something really terrible might happen, and you're left in this kind of spiraling situation there.
Yeah, no, exactly. That's kind of the problem, is that you get into this bind where, because people aren't familiar with it's not the norm that people have those tools. Therefore,
I did hear that door.
Yeah, that's right. I put a pause in there, so hopefully you can cut it nicely. Yeah, so blah, blah, blah. Yeah, because hammers are what it's expected. When hammers are not used, then there's again a bit of shock and awe there. The other really nice thing that Terence Real points out, and it's one of, I think, another thing to like try and drive this point home, is there's a thing called generational trauma, right? So, like if your parents have some sort of trauma which they don't deal with, that tends to be passed on to you in some sort of way, right? And about 2-3 generations ago, we had like a significant world war. I just recently finished listening to Dan Carden's Hardcore History about the Pacific Theatre, where a lot of, like, say, New Zealand folks ended up. And that was a horrific, like, war is horrific, and that was more horrific by orders of magnitude. And then those guys came home and had families and raised children. And the idea, and we never talked about it, and we never said anything. And so that, like, one of Terence Real's hypotheses is that trauma has just been passed down, and nobody stopped to deal with it ever.
So this is a fascinating conversation. I want to continue it, but we do need to pay the bills, so we will take a brief break, and we'll be back right after this.
Support this show and others like it by giving a donation. For more information, go to www.mpr.nz/donate.
My hand looks so big when I hold it in front of the camera to do the non-verbal count. Welcome back to Reserved Recommendations tonight. I'm talking to my brother Angus, who's very graciously joined us at god-awful o'clock in Glasgow in order for it to be a convenient time for me to talk to him from work here in New Zealand. Thank you very much, Angus, for doing that. Before the break, we were talking about the ways in which masculinity is a prison. That's a joke for Boiling Out Superfans, which is a podcast that you ought to listen to if you are remotely interested in hearing people discuss very old battle anime in the context of like modern leftist woke discourse. It's a lot of fun. However, I think I would like to stick my oar in with regard to whiteness here, because I think that that's a companion narrative that fits with the discussion that we've also been having. Because one of the things that I have been kind of observing around me, and I think it's a good thing, is that I've been watching the kind of Māori and Pacific renaissances happening. And people close to me actually are participating in courses and training and awareness things about reclaiming some Pacific heritage. And I've been watching that be a really powerful thing for those people. And one of the things that I've observed as a result, one of the things that occurs to me as a result of watching these people having these experiences is that it's very difficult for a white person to have that kind of an experience. And this is, again, when we come back to the caveat. If I say anything that sounds like it's leading up to a certain like 14-word phrase or maybe suggesting that a particular shadowy cabal of ethnically identifiable people are responsible for everything bad that's happened, stop. Like, wind back 10 minutes, listen to what I've said again. I am definitely not doing that. In fact, quite the reverse, because my thesis is that there is the defaultness that we talk about when we talk about masculinity and when we talk about whiteness constitute an erasure of identity. Like, we see other people as having identities. Women have identities, gay people have identities, well, queer people have identities, trans people have identities, ethnic minorities have identities. White people are plain white bread and have no cultural identifying factors at all. And what that means is that there is no coherent cultural power to draw on. Now, that's not to say that there's no such thing as culture from what we would consider white countries, but I think if you here's a fun exercise. Whenever you see someone jumping up and down about the obvious superiority of the West compared to other parts of the world, get them to define what they mean by the West, because you will find that they have a conception of the West that includes somehow like Enlightenment rationalism, but also the church, both Catholic and Protestant, which I will remind you fought horrific wars against one another, and also Shakespeare, and also the ancient Greeks, and also the ancient Romans. So there's this massive group of, but also not Marx, who was part of the Enlightenment school of thought. His Marxism is very much an Enlightenment rationalist project, albeit at the end of that chain of thought. So there's not. The idea of the West is incoherent. It doesn't make any sense. And if you want to say, well, I identify very strongly with the great canon of English literature, sure, fine, great. That's English culture. And English culture is fine and good, and I like lots of bits of it. I'm very fond, in particular, of the amiable, talking about problematic faves, the everything is amiable and we will ignore that imperialism exists vibe of Merry England stories like The Sword and the Stone and The Wind and the Willows. That's my just warm chicken soup for my brain comfort foods books. But that's English. That's not white. Because white is tied to this conception of the West that.
So yeah, I think that's it, right? I think so. Yeah, what it's important to separate, because fuck it, I'm in Scotland, and if you want a predominantly white but very strong cultural identity, come to Glasgow sometime. We have about 12. And the people who display that cultural identity and are fiercely, defending things like dialect and things like that are indeed white. I think whiteness as a thing was invented as a because you can see it kind of invented in colonial Britain and then exported to the USA and then blown up and then exported back over to the world throughout the TV, because you needed the white man so that you could show how the black man was different, right? That was the kind of divide.
Yeah, I mean, there's precursors to whiteness in ideas like Christendom. There's this thing that I was recently made aware of as a result of this course about rediscovering Pacific power, called the Discovery Doctrine, and that was part of a papal bull in the 15th century, which kind of predates the idea of whiteness, but does give Christendom mandate over civilizing the rest of the world, but it's viewed through that Catholic religious lens rather than through the ethnographic lens, because ethnography hadn't been invented yet, and that would come when it had been.
Yeah, no, entirely. But there is a kind of, like, either you're a Catholic or you're not. Though we could get into divisions about how Catholicism gets real weird sometime. But like that's a really clear line. You're either Catholic or you're not, right? Whiteness is not that, and that was kind of the important thing. It was like, if you're white, you know about it because you're not in the fields, or you're not in the ships, or you're not in a village somewhere, right? You're not one of those sort. So it was defined as, if you're white, and otherwise things. And so therefore, like, it's an empty category, right? It doesn't mean anything.
Yeah.
And that's unlike, and I think I kind of want to uncouple that from like maleness, because I think, some people present male and some people present female. And that does seem to mean things, because we still have that mean something in society. And so it is meaningful to talk about the problems that affect people who present as male. It feels less meaningful to talk in any way about, like, oh, there are these problems presenting as white. And you're like,
well, so,
because, yeah.
Here's where I'm going to disagree with you on that, because I think, in the sense, I think the related issue is that in the way that men can say, I have this problem, and people can say, people from the side of who believe in that form of masculinity can say, well, real men don't admit weakness, just nut up and power through it, and people who are unsympathetic because of their own struggles can say, well, you own the world, so what's your actual problem? In the same way, people who are Māori and feel rootless can go back to Māoritanga and go, right, well, this is where I come from. This is the core that I've lost. This is a thing that I can learn from. This is a resource I can draw on. Pacific people, similarly, there are deep, strong cultural traditions there which have been suppressed, but still exist, and people are rediscovering. If you are white and you feel rootless, whiteness. Let me borrow a metaphor from manga. In the manga Berserk, demons are people who have enormous power because they have fed whatever was dearest to them to all of the other demons. And whiteness is like that for cultural identity. You get to have the power, but you have to burn your cultural identity. Irish people are now white. They started being white because they stopped speaking Irish and agreed to join the police force and step on people who weren't white.
Yeah, so like I'm not. It's difficult, right? Because there's this massive boom in genealogy, and so one of the fun games is as a young man who grew up mainly in New Zealand. I came back to the UK and has spent some time around Europe because things. There is also a game called Universus Europa Universalis, made by Paradox Interactive, which takes place in about 1100, 1400, that era. What explains the experience of going around Europe much better than modern maps that you'll see in an atlas today is the map from 1400, right? People, I had a partner who was German, and she was very strictly from her part of Germany, and she will tell you all of the other things wrong with every other, like, ex-princedom of Germany. There are people who are, say, Flemish, and they're Flemish, they are not Dutch or German or French or wherever. If you go to Barcelona, you are in, what is it called? It's gone on my head, and they're going to be yelling at me. But you're from that area.
Yeah.
Right?
No,
they are looking for independence. Right?
I know exactly the thing you're talking about. We have two mutual friends who are both from the Netherlands, but they're from different bits of the Netherlands, and one of the ways that manifests is that one of them has a different pronunciation of the consonant pairing CH than the other. And I used to tease the other one by picking up her like soft pronunciation of that and using it in his name, because I knew it would wind him up in an affectionate way. But yeah,
even so, I mean, thinking about New Zealand, right? Like there is a really strong. We both came for a long time in Dunedin, and there's a really strong Dunedin cultural vibe, right? Like scarfies and like Spates shorts and singlets and stuff, and the Southern Man adverts, right? Like that's a real cultural. It's not a good thing, but it's a real cultural surrounding points. Those Spates ads, they're like, it's hard road finding a perfect woman. Like that's a real Southland identity, right? And the whole like cut the cable movement, for instance, right? There's this kind of, you do get these very like regional cultural identities. And so like, I would just like, we're Scots, French Huguenot, like hybrids, right?
Yeah. Although, I mean, I guess the counterpoint there is that the concept of genetic inheritance, like of being able to send a spit sample somewhere and for them to tell you that you're 1/18th Cherokee, like that is a very white, by which I mean based in race science that derives specifically in the service of colonialism. Yes, Angus is making phrenology, miming phrenology at me. Imagine for yourself how one mimes phrenology. But like that's where that comes from, and that's utterly unlike the ways in which, for example, Māori conceptualize membership of an iwi, in which case it's 0% to do with like how you present in terms of phenotype, because there are some very fair-skinned Māori. There are like white, red-haired Samoan people. It's like this recessive thing that pops out every so often that's like a really strong thing that shows up there. It's fascinating. What it's about is how you were raised and who you're related to, and like where that connects you into the web of relationships between people that the world is built out of for them. So I feel comfortable laying claim to some extent to Scottish identity, because we both lived there for a fair amount of time, and our dad is Scottish enough to still have the accent completely unshakably, and that bleeds through in a number of ways. But I wouldn't feel comfortable saying that I was in any sense culturally Danish or culturally French, because like those are not things that I have any real reference point or connection to.
Yeah, so like one of the really interesting touch points for me, because I'm a chef and I teach people, when I can again, I will teach people to cook, is recipes is a really good way to track kind of cultural heritage. If you ever want to start a fight in Scotland, ask somebody how to make stovies. But that's like, so we grew up with this sort of mix of family recipes that come from various places, and some of those are really Scottish, like stovies, for instance. But I think some of those other ones like trace down from that other side, right? Like it's one of those things, I think, like you say, once you're inside something, it's very hard to see what it is, which is unique in your tiny little part of the world. And I think the more I move out and meet other people and see how they cook and see what they cook, for instance, like it shows how like there was this particular cultural bubble that we grew up in. And I think because there's this kind of there's this cultural assumption that, oh, you're white, then you know all the other things that all of the other white people do, right? Like that weird thing that happens to lots of people of various other colors, various other people of color, like, oh, you're this ethnicity. Well, you must know this other person who's from that ethnicity.
And to be fair, depending on the ethnicity, that's like entirely fair. Like if you ask a Samoan if they know another Samoan, then like it's the answer is probably like no, but I know their cousin, or I know their brother, or yeah, like I don't know them, but like they're my auntie's like in-laws, so they're like we've never met them, but we're like related somehow, because some people just do be that way.
But yeah, like that's the thing, right? But there's that assumption that there is this whiteness, and I think that's as we said that's a myth, right? Like the ways that the bubble of culture that I grew up in is very different. Like, you know, we have a mutual friend who we connected very strongly through because we've both been grown up with the Goon Show, which is like a desperately white thing to grow up listening to. But a lot of our other friends just looked at us confusedly when we started down that rabbit hole.
Because I mean, the Goon Show more specifically than white is a very British thing to grow up with. I mean, the reason that we grew up with it is because partly our parents were fans because of sense of humor reasons, and the New Zealand one of them having been raised at that period where New Zealand was still kind of Little Brittany. But also we spent time in the UK where they actually played reruns of the Goon Show on the actual BBC as like it's been 50 years since the Goon Show, here's some Goon Show stuff. And so that was a thing that you could just hear still. Whereas I think at that point our contemporaries would have been getting much more what was on TV, and what was on TV specifically in New Zealand at that point in time.
Yeah. But yeah, like, so I think that claim that whiteness is as a kind of loss of culture is usually because there is this default assumption, right? Like if you're born at a party and somebody of color turns up, you're like, oh, where are you from? Where are your parents from? That sort of people. If you're one of those people, don't do that. Most of the people I know who are foreign hate it when people do that. They're real people. Ask them about, like, you know, their interests or something. But like, that doesn't happen, right, to the rest of us, right? Like, nobody goes to somebody, oh, you know, where are your parents from, right? Like, oh, well, you know. So because it's just an assumption that it's blank, right? And so I think it's more kind of a willful ignorance or a willful, like, disruption of the idea of anybody who is white having culture, rather than there being a kind of lack of culture.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, insofar, I don't know that it's. I wouldn't say that all white people entirely lack culture. I guess what I would say is that because whiteness is fake, it contains too much of a diversity of culture to have any single culture of its own. Because people who are Norwegian are white, but people who are Norwegian come from a place where there has been continuous human settlement by largely the same group of people for a really long freaking time. So their experience of national culture is utterly different to that of Pakeha, who live in a place which was settled by white people, like vanishingly recently. And then, as you say, the idea that there could be a coherent German identity when Germany, I think, is actually younger than New Zealand as a single country. My dates may be wrong there, but Germany as a single unified country is actually shockingly new. It's a series of like princedoms and baronies that just decided that they were all one country for geopolitical reasons at one point and haven't stopped.
Yeah, no, I think that's like what I think the problem with whiteness as an idea is it because it just becomes a blanket thing that you just kind of drop it on top of everything. You're like, let's not ask any more questions. What's under the rug? Oh, don't worry about it. Like, you know, and yeah, I think so. Like, I think in that way, it differs from the concept of masculinity, because I think the concept of masculinity is, or at least, sorry, like being male presenting, right? Like there are some particular things about being male presenting in this world, and there are some like touchstones that if you get a fair collection of male presenting people together, that they can probably all identify those touchstones in a way that if you took a random sampling of people who are described by the blanket term white, finding shared cultural touchstones in any meaningful way other than maybe ever be seen like one episode of Seinfeld or something, like they're just not there, right?
Yes. Well, and at that point I have to announce that we are, despite having reached very little in the way of resolution, pretty much at time, which I suppose is to be expected when you try and have these sorts of discussions. Perhaps,
can I say one thing very quickly?
No, do so. I was going to invite you to.
As a kind of wrap up, like, here's a section that I thought was important to talk about, which is the maybe I'm wrong, right? Maybe because there's a perfectly good criticism of a lot of identity politics and of this sort of thing in total, which is what we're doing is confusing masculinity with class, right? That a lot of the problems as dysfunction is that because a lot of people who are working class or who find themselves in the working class have been told that they should be valued by their ability to produce and their ability to like make money, and that's what our worth is. And we are increasingly in a position where that becomes very, very hard. And I'm just kind of wanted to add that that's a perfectly valid criticism, and maybe that's right. But I think also it's very important to.
Yeah, I think that is a valid criticism, but I don't think it can be a complete criticism, because I think you will find that I think that the ways that people act out, so the crimes that people commit, the things that they do that they ought not to do, that they do not for immediate profit, differ between white and non-white people and between men and women. And men and white people are both much more likely to use violence to defend their own position somehow. And I think that there is definitely an element where both maleness and whiteness have been used as tools to subordinate a working class in order to say, you know, your job is to do this because you're this kind of person, in order to keep people being, you know, compliant and productive workers. But I don't think that can be a complete analysis, because I do think that working class women and working class POC also get messages about the kind of work they should do based on the kind of person they are, and proportionally they kill and injure a lot less people in response to their lives going poorly. And I do think that that's illustrative.
Yeah, no, entirely. I think it's whenever you're having these discussions around identity, it's often useful to intersectionally pull in class, because there are sometimes cases where people run a misidentification. They say, "Oh, look at all of look at this problem that affects this class of people," and sometimes that is like people of color, right? This problem affects those people of color in this particular area, and you can say, "Well, that's because they have been pushed into the working class, and that's just how we treat working class people, guys." So this is a problem about about class, not which is bound up with the problems of racism, and they're mixed together, because why not have just one? So it's sometimes important to pull in the idea of class, I think.
Yeah, I think maybe we'll see how both of our schedules line up and what we think after we've signed off on this, but maybe this is a conversation that demands a part 2 at some point, where we maybe go into more detail on strategies about stuff, because I think there are strategies that you can use both as a bloke and a white person to navigate through this to a more useful point of view. And I think that you can have reserved recommendations about those strategies, because as we've kind of been hinting on the way past, a lot of the people who claim to speak to these problems are actually trying to convince you to join a club where you wear nice shiny black uniforms with big boots and go and step on a shadowy but ethnically identifiable cabal who are secretly to blame for all of the world's ills. And I think maybe a fruitful thing to come back to would be conversations about ways out of this that avoid getting in touch with people who are of the fasci persuasion. Thank you very much for participating in this conversation, such as it was.
You're most welcome.
In the meantime, before we potentially do that part 2, are there things that you would recommend? I know there was a video series that you sent me to have a look at when you first proposed masculinity as a topic of conversation.
Yeah, so the Guardian UK, I've forgotten her name who has organised it, but one of their reporters has done a very good Guardian YouTube series about masculinity, which is, I think, going into its 3rd season, and that's well worth looking at. Also, I Don't Want to Talk About It by Terence is a really good book to read. If you are male, or if you have a male person in your life, it might be worth reading to understand some things. Also, if it is available in your area, if it is covered things, go chat to a therapist. Hey guys, go chat to a therapist. If you are male presenting and listening to this and haven't done that, go have a chat to one. It's not a sign of weakness. It's like we go to doctors for checkups. You should probably go to a therapist for a checkup. That I know that's sometimes prohibitively expensive, and that's sometimes difficult because, especially right now, lots of the therapists are very busy. But I think it will be well worth your time. So go do that.
Yes, I think those are all good recommendations on the topic of whiteness. If you Google the invention of whiteness, you will discover a range of articles and links to books and things about the idea of the invention of whiteness. And I think that as a white person who has not thought particularly hard about your ethnic identity, then that is probably worth going and having a look at, because it gives you a sense of where the idea that there are a group of people who you can coherently refer to as white came from is a good start to unpacking that if you feel like ethnic identity is a thing that is important to you. And on the topic of therapy, one of the things that you find as you get older is that stuff that was just peachy keen kind of creeps up on you. And one of the things that creeps up on some people is a concern about ethnic identity. So trying to figure out what that is and where it came from and how it works might be a helpful start in that sense.
Yeah, and like on top of that, one more thing, your feelings are valid, right? Like this is, again, I guess something that I think probably a lot of our male listeners don't hear enough. Like if you have had some difficult feelings listening to us talk about some of this stuff, that's okay. You are entitled to your feelings. What you're not entitled to is to make other people suffer for those, but you are entitled to feel how you feel, and that's okay. So
that was a pair of thumbs for people,
up, right?
People who are listening, which is the only way that you can consume this podcast. Yeah. All right. Yeah. Thank you very much.
You've been listening to Reserved Recommendations, a radio show and podcast from Manawatu People's Radio, Te Reo Irirangi o ngā tangata o Manawatu. The show is produced and presented by me, Hugh Dingwall, and I also composed our theme music. It's called Sack Jazz, and you can find it at wolfboy.bandcamp.com. You can find me on the internet at Objective Realty on Twitter, and you can find the show on Facebook under Reserved Recommendations. If you've got a reserved recommendation of your own, feel free to pitch it to me in either of those two places. And if you enjoyed the show, why not go ahead and recommend it to a friend? You can find past episodes at www.mpr.nz/show/reserved on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. And remember, Manawatu People's Radio is a non-profit radio station. If you enjoy this or any of their other fine audio programming, why not fling them a couple of dollars? Go to mpr.nz/donate for more information.